Late summer, 1631. Along the Elbe River, near the small town of Werben, the war pauses just long enough for a mistake to form. 70 Swedish infantrymen hold a shallow defensive position. Mud, reeds, rough earthworks, nothing more. They are musketeers and pikemen trained under a new system of war, drilled to fire as one body rather than as individuals. They are not reinforced. They are not meant to fight here. They are meant to delay. Across open ground, 600 Imperial Cavalry assemble, armored horsemen of the Holy Roman Empire. Veterans, raiders, shock troops raised on a single belief: no infantry formation can stand once cavalry commits at full force. The numbers alone promise certainty. More than 8 cavalrymen for every infantryman. Steel, speed, mass, and momentum against a thin line of foot soldiers. By every accepted rule of early 17th century warfare, what is about to happen should take minutes. One charge, one collapse, 70 dead or captured. Instead, Werben becomes something else entirely, because on this field, firearms and formation are about to dismantle centuries of cavalry dominance, one volley at a time. The fighting near Werben did not begin as a planned battle. It began as a consequence of movement, pressure, and timing, inside a war already spiraling out of control. By late summer of 1631, the 30 Years' War had entered one of its most violent phases. Imperial armies moved aggressively across northern Germany, feeding themselves through requisition and terror, stripping the countryside to sustain cavalry-heavy forces that relied on speed, intimidation, and shock. Towns that resisted were burned. Garrisons that hesitated were crushed. Mobility was power. The Elbe River was central to this strategy. Control of its crossings meant control of supply, movement, and communication. Armies that held the river dictated where battles could happen and where they could not. The Swedish army under Gustavus Adolphus had crossed into the German theatre with a radically different philosophy of war. Instead of relying on massive cavalry dominance alone, the Swedes emphasized coordination, infantry, firearms, limited cavalry support, and flexible formations designed to fight under pressure rather than break from it. Werben sat near this fault line. The Swedish presence there was not intended to force a battle. The infantry detachment was positioned to observe, delay, and screen larger movements along the river. Their task was time, not victory. Every hour they held mattered elsewhere along the Elbe. Imperial commanders, however, read the situation differently. To them, Werben looked like opportunity. A small, isolated Swedish element. No visible cavalry support. Minimal fortification. A chance to erase resistance quickly and reinforce the narrative that Imperial cavalry remained unstoppable in the open. This assumption was logical by the standards of the age. For generations, cavalry had dominated European battlefields. Infantry without deep formations or heavy pike blocks rarely survived a determined mounted assault. Firearms existed, but many commanders still saw them as unreliable, slow, and psychologically weak against armored horsemen. Imperial doctrine trusted the charge. Speed would close distance, mass would break cohesion, fear would finish the rest. But what the Imperial cavalry did not fully understand was that Swedish infantry doctrine had quietly removed fear from the equation. These men were drilled not to react to cavalry, but to absorb it. They were trained to wait, to fire together, to reload under pressure, and to hold formation even as horses closed the distance. Discipline was no longer moral, it was mechanical. Werben was where these two systems collided, by accident. A cavalry force built for momentum met an infantry force built to deny it. And the terrain near the Elbe narrowed that collision into a killing zone. By the time Imperial cavalry committed to the attack, retreat was already politically unacceptable. A withdrawal from 70-foot soldiers would signal weakness. Confidence demanded action. So the order went out: advance, commit, break them. What followed would expose a truth the war was not yet ready to admit. The balance of power on the battlefield had begun to shift. Imperial cavalry in 1631 did not see themselves as one arm among many. They believed they were the decisive arm. For decades before Werben, mounted shock troops had shaped how battles were won in Central Europe. Cavalry was fast, expensive, and socially elite. Most riders were not conscripts. They were professionals, often nobles, trained to believe that momentum itself was a weapon. Once unleashed, they were not meant to pause, hesitate, or reassess. They were meant to break enemies psychologically before steel even landed. Imperial doctrine revolved around this belief. The cavalry charge was designed to overwhelm infantry on 3 levels at once. First came speed, closing distance before volleys could be fired accurately. Second came mass, compressed formations that looked unstoppable from the ground. Third came terror, the thunder of hooves, the visual shock of armored men bearing down at full force. Most infantry did not wait. They fired too early. They broke formation. They ran. When that happened, cavalry did not fight a battle. They conducted a slaughter. Imperial commanders had seen this pattern repeated countless times. Light infantry scattered, militia dissolved. Even trained foot soldiers often collapsed, once horses reached killing distance. To the cavalry officer corps, this was not theory. It was experience. Firearms, in their view, were unreliable against determined mounted troops. Muskets were slow to reload, inaccurate beyond short range, and vulnerable to disruption. A single poorly timed volley could doom an entire line. Cavalry believed they could absorb that first shot and then annihilate what remained. That confidence shaped how they approached Werben. The cavalry assembled without caution. There was no extended reconnaissance for alternate routes, no serious concern about infantry fire lanes. The assumption was simple. Numbers plus shock would decide everything. 600 riders against 70-foot soldiers did not require finesse. It required commitment. Imperial cavalry also relied heavily on offensive instinct. Once a charge began, stopping it was considered dangerous. Horses packed tightly could not easily turn. Riders trusted that pressure forward was safer than hesitation. This mindset discouraged flexible response once contact was made. At Werben, that rigidity would become lethal. The cavalry expected a single decisive moment, one powerful surge that would smash through the Swedish line. They did not prepare for sustained resistance. They did not anticipate multiple volleys fired with precision and discipline. They did not imagine infantry that would stand and reload while horses closed the gap. Most critically, they underestimated fire coordination. Imperial cavalry had faced muskets before. They had not faced muskets used as a system. At Werben, every assumption they carried onto the field would be tested simultaneously. And when the charge finally came, the cavalry would discover that confidence, when unchallenged for too long, becomes blindness. The 70 Swedish infantrymen at Werben were not exceptional because of courage. They were exceptional because of design. By 1631, the Swedish army had undergone a quiet revolution under Gustavus Adolphus. Infantry were no longer treated as passive bodies meant to absorb cavalry until something better arrived. They were trained as the decisive mechanism of battle, precise, disciplined, and lethal when used correctly. The foundation of this system was fire coordination. Swedish musketeers were drilled relentlessly to fire together, not individually. A single musket was unreliable. 70 muskets firing as one body were devastating. Officers controlled distance, timing, and rhythm. Men were trained to wait, sometimes until cavalry filled their vision before pulling the trigger. This discipline removed panic from the moment of contact. Behind the musketeers stood pikemen, not as a wall but as stabilizers. Their role was psychological as much as physical. They prevented riders from closing gaps, discouraged reckless penetration, and reinforced the infantry's confidence that the line would not dissolve. Equally important was reload discipline. Swedish infantry were trained to reload under threat. Movements were simplified. Motions were memorized until they became reflex. Even as horses advanced, even as smoke choked the air, the line continued to function. One rank fired, another reloaded, another waited. This created the illusion of endless fire. The terrain amplified these advantages. Muddy ground near the Elbe limited cavalry's speed. Reeds and broken earth disrupted formation. Shallow earthworks forced riders to funnel into narrow approaches, concentrating targets exactly where Swedish fire was most effective. Crucially, the Swedish infantry did not chase success. They did not advance. They did not pursue. They held. Holding was the system. Every second the line remained intact multiplied the cavalry's losses and drained its momentum. Horses slowed. Riders hesitated. Formations compressed. What cavalry doctrine depended on, speed and cohesion, began to collapse. The 70 men at Werben were not improvising. They were executing training exactly as designed. Against that system, numbers alone were meaningless. The first Imperial Cavalry advance began without drama. There was no full gallop, no reckless surge. The riders moved forward deliberately, pistols ready, lances angled, expecting the Swedish line to flinch long before impact. This measured approach was standard doctrine. Close the distance, absorb a volley if necessary, then finish the fight with speed and weight. From the Swedish position, nothing moved. Muskets remained lowered. Officers watched distance, not faces. The infantry line stayed silent as hooves beat closer and closer, the ground trembling under advancing mass. This silence mattered. Most infantry fired too early. Fear shortened distance. Panic wasted powder. The Swedes did neither. They waited until cavalry filled the firing lanes completely, until horses, riders, and armor compressed into a single advancing shape. Then the order came. 70 muskets fired at once. The volley did not strike a charge in motion. It struck a formation at the exact moment it needed cohesion. Most horses collapsed forward. Riders were thrown into one another. The front of the formation folded inward, not backward. Momentum died instantly, replaced by confusion and pain. Before the cavalry could reorganize, the Swedish line was already reloading. The second volley came faster than the first. Smoke swallowed the field. Shouts replaced commands. Riders fired pistols wildly, but accuracy vanished inside the chaos. Horses refused to push forward over fallen bodies. The narrow ground forced the cavalry inward, packing men and animals together where every musket ball found flesh. Still, the cavalry tried to press. This was doctrine asserting itself against reality. Another volley followed. This time, the psychological break began. Riders slowed instinctively. Horses turned sideways. Officers shouted for order that could no longer be imposed. What should have been a single decisive moment stretched into something far worse, a sustained killing zone. The Swedish infantry did not advance. They did not cheer. They reloaded. The charge had failed, not because cavalry lacked courage, but because it had lost momentum, timing, and space. Against disciplined fire, bravery alone was irrelevant. The battle had crossed its point of no return. What destroyed the Imperial Cavalry at Werben was not firepower alone. It was firepower organized in time and space. Early 17th century muskets were slow, inaccurate, and individually unreliable. One man firing one weapon could not stop a horse at speed. But the Swedish system never relied on individuals. It relied on mathematics. The infantry line was arranged to maximize probability. Ranks were spaced to avoid panic spread. Files were aligned so that every musket covered overlapping ground. When the order to fire came, 70 projectiles entered a confined space simultaneously, not aimed at riders, but at horse mass. A charging cavalry formation compresses itself naturally. Horses bunch. Riders align. The faster they move, the closer together they become. What cavalry doctrine called momentum, Swedish doctrine treated as target density. At Werben, each volley struck at the moment density peaked. Reloading was equally calculated. The Swedish infantry did not fire in a continuous stream. They fired in controlled pulses. One rank discharged, another prepared, another held. This rhythm created repeated shock waves, rather than a single expenditure of force. To cavalry it felt endless. Horses that survived the first volley encountered smoke, noise, fallen mounts, and wounded animals thrashing in pain. This slowed movement further, increasing exposure time. Every second inside musket range multiplied casualty probability. The formation itself never wavered. Men did not step forward to pursue wounded riders. They did not step back under pressure. They held exact spacing. This prevented gaps cavalry depended on to punch through. Imperial riders attempted adaptation. Pistols were fired at close range. Small groups tried to surge independently, but cavalry is weakest when fragmented. Without cohesion, speed becomes liability rather than advantage. Each failed push worsened the next. Mud-clogged hooves. Smoke-blinded officers. Fallen horses created physical barricades. The battlefield itself began to fight against the cavalry. The Swedish infantry exploited none of this actively. They simply continued executing the system. Fire, reload, hold, fire, reload, hold. At this point, the outcome was no longer emotional or heroic. It was statistical. The longer the cavalry remained engaged, the worse the equation became. Werben had stopped being a battle of courage. It had become a problem of arithmetic, and the cavalry was losing. Cavalry doctrine depended on belief as much as steel. Mounted shock worked because infantry usually broke first. The sight, sound, and speed of a charge triggered instinct. Once fear spread, cohesion collapsed. Cavalry did not need to kill everyone. They only needed to make the line dissolve. At Werben, that belief failed. The Swedish infantry did not react as cavalry expected. They did not fire early. They did not shout. They did not move. Every volley came at the same distance. Every reload followed the same rhythm. To the riders, this consistency felt unnatural, almost mechanical. Psychological pressure shifted direction. Horses sensed danger before riders did. Smoke burned their eyes. The noise of coordinated volleys echoed off the riverbank. The ground was slick with mud and blood. Fallen animals blocked paths. Each step forward felt less certain than the last. Riders began making individual decisions. Some slowed instinctively. Some tried to veer around obstacles. Some pulled pistols too early, firing without aim. Once cavalry behavior fragmented, command authority collapsed. Officers shouted orders that could not be heard or obeyed. Tight formations loosened. Spacing widened. Momentum essential to shock evaporated. The Swedish infantry noticed none of this emotionally. They noticed it procedurally. Targets became clearer. Exposure time increased. Volleys landed with greater effect. Every failed push reinforced doubt. Riders who had expected an easy breakthrough now faced repeated punishment without progress. Courage turned into frustration. Confidence turned into caution. Caution, under fire, became panic. The most dangerous moment for cavalry is not impact. It is hesitation under fire. At Werben, hesitation spread faster than fear ever had among infantry. Horses refused commands. Riders dismounted unwillingly as mounts fell. Small groups tried to rally, but rallying requires space, and space no longer existed. Meanwhile, the Swedish line remained intact. Men reloaded with shaking hands and steady motions. They did not look at the cavalry as individuals. They looked at distances. They listened for commands. They trusted the system more than their instincts. Psychologically, the battle had inverted. The infantry no longer feared the cavalry. The cavalry feared the infantry. Once that reversal occurred, the outcome was sealed. The moment the Imperial Cavalry broke was not sudden. It unfolded in fragments. Small groups began pulling back without orders. Riders turned their horses sideways, searching for space that no longer existed. What had once been a forward surge dissolved into a mass of conflicting movements. Advance, halt, retreat, all happening at once. This was the most dangerous phase for cavalry. A mounted force relies on direction. Once direction disappears, speed amplifies chaos. Horses collided. Riders shouted warnings too late. Fallen mounts created barriers that could not be crossed quickly. Every attempt to reorganize exposed men to another disciplined volley. The Swedish infantry did not chase the collapse. They did not rush forward. They maintained position and continued firing into exposed targets. This restraint was decisive. As the cavalry pulled back, their formations elongated. Tight ranks stretched into thin lines, then into scattered clusters. Each withdrawal increased vulnerability. Muskets now struck riders at angles once protected by cohesion. Horses attempting to flee presented clear profiles. Officers trying to rally stood out and fell. The rout accelerated. Dust mixed with smoke. Shouts turned into screams. Commands were replaced by instinctive flight toward open ground away from the riverbank. Some riders abandoned weapons. Others dismounted, trying to escape through reeds and mud on foot. There was no organized pursuit, because none was required. Terrain punished retreat, as brutally as fire punished advance. Mud sucked at hooves. Reeds tangled legs. Wounded horses collapsed mid-flight, throwing riders forward into the path of others. What began as tactical withdrawal became complete disorder. The Swedish infantry finally advanced, only when resistance ceased. Not to pursue, but to secure ground. They stepped forward cautiously, muskets ready, expecting renewed attack that never came. The battlefield belonged to silence, broken only by wounded men and animals. The engagement that should have lasted minutes had consumed the cavalry's fighting capacity entirely. By the time Imperial survivors regrouped at distance, the truth was unavoidable. The attack had not merely failed, it had collapsed. When the field near Werben finally fell quiet, the numbers told a story no commander wanted to read. Imperial cavalry losses were severe, not merely in dead and wounded, but in combat effectiveness. Horses lay scattered across the mud, many killed outright, others wounded beyond use. Riders who survived were disorganized, separated from units, and stripped of cohesion. A cavalry force that could not charge together could not fight. The Swedish losses were minimal by comparison. This imbalance mattered more than raw body counts. Cavalry is expensive. Horses take years to train. Riders require skill, equipment, and confidence. Losing them, even temporarily, meant operational paralysis. The Imperial force near Werben had been reduced from an offensive weapon into a liability within a single engagement. The ratio shocked observers. 70 infantrymen had neutralized hundreds of mounted troops. Even conservative accounting revealed an outcome that defied accepted probability. What should have been a swift suppression became a demonstration of systemic failure. Word traveled quickly. Imperial officers who received reports struggled to explain what had happened. There was no ambush to blame, no hidden reinforcements, no terrain trap, dramatic enough to excuse defeat. The cavalry had attacked as doctrine demanded and been destroyed by infantry fire that refused to break. This created ripple effects far beyond Werben. Cavalry commanders began hesitating. Infantry positions, once dismissed as fragile, were reassessed. Small Swedish detachments suddenly commanded caution disproportionate to their size. The psychological advantage cavalry had enjoyed for generations began to erode. Even victories elsewhere felt less secure. If 70 men could do this, what could 200 do? What could a full brigade accomplish? Werben injected doubt into planning rooms and field orders alike. It forced a recalculation of risk. Attacks that once relied on speed now required preparation. Infantry could no longer be brushed aside. They had to be suppressed, disrupted, or avoided. This was not a single tactical loss. It was a doctrinal wound. Numbers had betrayed confidence, and confidence once cracked never fully returns. Werben mattered because it exposed a future that many commanders were resisting. For generations, European warfare had privileged shock. Cavalry embodied that belief. Speed over precision, courage over calculation. Infantry existed to support momentum, not to dictate outcomes. Werben reversed that hierarchy in a way that could not be ignored. The lesson was not that cavalry was obsolete. It was that cavalry was no longer supreme. Firearms, when integrated into disciplined formations, had crossed a threshold. They were no longer supplemental weapons. They had become decisive systems. Swedish infantry demonstrated that controlled fire could stop punish, and ultimately dismantle mounted assaults without needing deep pike squares or overwhelming numbers. This forced adaptation. Cavalry commanders began spacing formations wider, reducing charge density to avoid catastrophic volleys. Pistols and carbines gained importance, shifting cavalry toward fire and maneuver roles rather than pure shock. Infantry positions were scouted more carefully. Terrain once ignored became critical. Infantry doctrine evolved as well. Werben reinforced the value of drill over bravery. Officers across Europe studied Swedish methods, volley timing, reload discipline, formation spacing, and restraint under pressure. The idea that infantry should hold, rather than chase, spread rapidly. The psychological impact was just as significant. Once infantry proved they could stand against cavalry, fear lost its utility. Battles became contests of preparation rather than intimidation. Commanders who relied on reputation alone found diminishing returns. Those who embraced coordination gained advantage. Werben also highlighted a deeper truth. Warfare was becoming less personal and more procedural. Victory depended on systems that functioned under stress, not individuals seeking glory. Discipline replaced impulse. Mathematics replaced tradition. The engagement near the Elbe did not end the 30 Years' War, but it clarified its direction. From that point forward, battles increasingly favored armies that could synchronize fire, manage space, and maintain cohesion under pressure. Werben was not the first sign of this shift, but it was among the clearest. A small field, a brief fight, a permanent change. The field near Werben was not large. The engagement was not long, but its consequences traveled far beyond the Elbe. In the weeks that followed, the battle became a reference point, not because of its scale, but because of its clarity. Commanders did not debate what happened. They debated why it happened, and every explanation led back to the same conclusion. The old hierarchy of the battlefield was breaking down. Cavalry would remain vital, but never again unquestioned. The Swedish infantry model demonstrated that war was no longer decided by who struck hardest first, but by who could function longest under pressure. Systems that absorbed shock replaced tactics that relied on creating it. Firearms, once treated as unreliable accessories, became the backbone of battlefield control. This shift did not happen overnight. Many officers resisted it. Tradition is stubborn, especially when tied to honor and status. But Werben made denial expensive. Every failed charge afterward echoed the same warning. Discipline had overtaken bravado. The 70 men at Werben were not remembered by name. They did not become legends. And that, perhaps, is the point. Their victory was not individual. It was structural. Any unit trained the same way, placed in the same conditions, could replicate the outcome. That realization terrified traditionalists. If victory no longer required heroic elites, then warfare belonged to preparation, logistics, and repetition. Armies became machines. Battles became problems to be solved, not contests of courage to be displayed. Werben represented that turning point in miniature. A small detachment, given a simple task, delay proved that even limited forces could dominate superior numbers when doctrine aligned with reality. They did not improvise. They did not gamble. They executed training exactly as intended. Fire, reload, hold. Centuries of cavalry dominance were not ended in a single battle, but at Werben they were exposed as fragile, dependent on fear, momentum, and assumption. Once those assumptions failed, the entire structure wobbled. The mathematics of war had changed, and from that moment forward, battles would increasingly be won, not by who charged first, but by who understood the equation better.